Welcome to the Mount Gretna School of Art Lecture Series hosted here in the Pennsylvania Chautauqua's Hall of Philosophy. I'd like to thank a couple of our big lecture sponsors for the summer. One is the Arts for All partnership of the Foundation for Enhancing Communities, and the other big one is Stinson Strout. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce Melanie Johnson, who's our lead drawing instructor for the last half of the session. And she came over from Kansas City, where she teaches nearby at the University of Central Missouri. And she has her MFA from IU and studied at Missouri State for her BFA. She's had a couple shows, which you might find a record of online, at Manifest and First Street Gallery in New York. And I'm glad she's here. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Jay, for the introduction. I am so pleased to be at Mount Gretna School of Art in such good company. It really is an honor to be here. Like it's been a great week so far, and I know, I'm really happy for the next week coming up. So, like Jay said, I'm coming here from Kansas City, and I teach at the University of Central Missouri. So I teach drawing and painting there. And my studio practice is primarily large-scale drawing at this point, but my background, both for my undergraduate degree and my graduate degree, were in painting. So I still think I kind of dream in paint a little bit. So there's, sort of a back and forth that happens between drawing and painting in my work. I'm going to show work spanning from undergraduate through what I've been working on fairly recently. But I'm going to start with my background and some influences and experiences that I think create like a through line in multiple bodies of work. So I'm from Kansas City originally. I grew up in the suburbs of Kansas City and in semi-rural areas. I grew up the kid of a veterinarian, so I was literally raised alongside animals. This is Petey the pet grackle, and I had when I was about 3. And this is an image of my dad and my fat little pony that I took with my first roll of black and white film when I was about 12 or 13. I was like super proud of my black and white film. And I think it's interesting that, what I chose to take images of was this space and animals. And my bonds with animals continue to be an important part of my life and show up in my work quite a bit. I spend a lot of time in nature, and I don't necessarily work outside. So my studio practice doesn't really go outside. Like I don't work on site, but I do spend a lot of time hiking and recording and collecting things. So like I'm constantly looking down and picking things up and bringing them back to the studio. And this is an image on a hike with the dogs Levi and Iris. I am an avid reader. So writers like Annie Dillard and Rebecca Solnit and Kathleen Jamie and poets like Mary Oliver and Sharon Olds really helped me articulate, some of my ideas and sensibilities in the studio through their writing about nature and human relationships. So this is an image of Mary Oliver and her dog on the left that I love, and a Sharon Olds book that really had a huge impact on me. I've been really fortunate to spend a lot of time in Italy in undergraduate and as a graduate student, and then a few times since then. And so this is my most recent trip a few years ago with my son. And I think you'll see throughout in my work that, being in Italy, looking at Italian painting really shapes my visual sensibilities. And it's also really kind of taught me how to tell a story. And so I think a lot about narrative when I'm looking at Italian work. I wanted to show the first painting that I really fell in love with. And That's the painting here on the left. It's a really early Guston. I think he did when he was like 20, called If This Be Not I. It lives in the WashU collection in St. Louis. And I think I first saw this when I was about 19. And, I didn't know exactly what it was that was so attractive. Like I couldn't put my finger on why it was so perfect. But there was something about this really kind of dense Italianate palette and this crazy kind of narrative that's going on that, like there's this implied narrative with all of these characters who are up to something. And so that was really a hook for me in terms of like what I was thinking about in painting. I was really kind of interested in these mysterious stories. And then, kind of as a bookend, this is late Guston. I was able to see this painting a few years ago in Venice. And this is a painting called East Coker after the T.S. Eliot poem. And it, like that poem really is about, like time and faith. And, when I think about late Guston, I think about, like human vulnerability and fallibility and, also kind of this like flat-footedness in Guston that really resonates in my work. And this is Myra Coleman. Myra Coleman is actually an illustrator. And, what I love about Myra Coleman is this juxtaposition of levity and gravity, that she says that like delight is the brother of despair. She's like a first generation Holocaust survivor, and she lost her husband of 30 years, recently, and makes work about that, of like finding joy in these really kind of dark moments in our lives. And, I think like, even though these are kind of lighthearted, they very much operate in a minor key. And, I think like I also kind of tend to operate in that minor key. I'm also a mom, and I love being a mom, but I think, like it's worth saying that, like the sort of emotional labor of parenting is real, and that balance of, being in the studio and parenting is something that is a thing. But I wanted to talk about this because, like being a parent has really influenced, how I think about human relationships, and specifically, like this experience of being a parent that is this kind of constant paradox of, joy and loss, that like I'm continually like losing this child. So you spend, like all of your energy in this amazing relationship, and the goal is to like essentially let go. And so this is my son in the green, Tillman, and my exchange kid, Ludo, in the red, and my nephew, Sam. Okay. So going back to undergraduate, when I was an undergraduate, I was really fortunate to be in a cohort of, really serious students. And the program itself was really rigorous in observational drawing, especially. There was a very formal approach to everything. And I was a really clumsy student. Like I was not naturally talented. And so, like I felt like I was working really, really hard to make good work. And so I took lots and lots of drawing classes. This is a drawing that I did from a life drawing class. And I felt like at this point, like I was starting to make work that, like felt solid. And at the same time, I was really drawn to telling stories. Like I really wanted to tell a story. And that was something that maybe wasn't so embraced by the program. So I found that I was, trying to like wiggle my way around and tell a story like inadvertently. And this was maybe like the first painting I did that I was really pleased with as an undergraduate. And I really I loved this taxidermy crocodile. This was in the studio, and I had to paint this thing. And, when I set this up, I was thinking about Manet's Bar at the Folies Bergère, but with a crocodile. And so, kind of suggesting that there's something going on here, that there's a little bit of a narrative happening. So towards the end of my undergraduate experience, I was really fortunate to spend 2 months in Italy, specifically in Florence and around Florence. And, as a student, I was a good student. I really liked art history. I felt like I was being, kind of diligent and But when I went to Italy for the first time, my mind was totally blown. Like there was so much work that I wasn't even aware of. And, what was striking to me that what I was, I was responding to work that, wasn't necessarily like in my mind at that time, like, good work, like it didn't feel like right. There was something kind of like crazy about this space. And I loved that it didn't make sense to me. But I think what I loved about this more was it really was like a story in a box. So these are like Trecento and Quattrocento paintings, panel paintings. These are Duccio. The left is from Duccio's Maesta. And so, like the image is contained in a box, but also like the architecture of the space starts to organize the story. So if you look at the left panel, like the mocking of Christ, there's this vertical here that really kind of keeps like Peter out of the situation. And then, if we look at, I think this is like Christ healing the blind on the right, there's this vertical that divides, Christ and his disciples from this like main event. And so, like the negative shape and that vertical of the architecture, really kind of brings our attention to this main event. And so when I came back, I had about a year left of undergrad, and I really wanted to do that. Like I was thinking about like, how could I tell a story? How could I use the rectangle of the canvas to tell a story? And so I was setting up these situations in my apartment, and I was being really stubborn at the same time. Like at this point, I was really convinced that I needed to paint from direct observation and that I needed to make large paintings. And so I set up this situation, kind of looking into the space, starting to think about, this omniscient point of view to set up a psychological narrative. But this dining room was like 8 foot by 10 foot, and this painting is about 6 foot by 6 foot. And so I was like on a ladder with this painting smushed up against a wall. And my friend Dave was coming in and sitting for me a couple of times a week. And this poor guy was like holding a knife, and he would actually sit with like an art book there and like turn the pages with that knife. I had like turkey drumsticks in my freezer for like weeks. And my poor dog Gunther, like he actually sat for me for this one. This one was made from sketches, but this poor dog sat. And this figure is actually invented. So again, like there's kind of a stubborn streak and maybe like a perversity in making things difficult as, like a way of validation that I think is, something that has run through my work and maybe started really early on. And I continued doing that, like really being interested in the conceit of the picture plane, using the rectangle to start to tell a story. And again, like I was getting friends to come in to sit for me. And here I was thinking about Artemisia Gentileschi's Judith and her maidservant, suggesting that something is going on outside of the picture plane. So, what we don't see is maybe more interesting than what's depicted here, but thinking also about point of view and creating a dramatic light source to set the tone for this psychological narrative. And so I went to graduate school at Indiana University, and I really thought that I would just keep doing what I'd been doing, that I was like onto something and I had something figured out. And so, when I got there, that's exactly what I did. I had a grant to hire models, and I was working in my apartment. And pretty quickly I was, sort of pushed away from that. And I was really, kind of flailing at that point. Like I didn't know how else to make a painting. And I kind of struggled a lot in grad school. I think that's kind of how grad school works, is that we struggle through some ideas. And so about the middle of my first year of graduate school, I was making paintings like this. And this is a really large painting, or relatively large. It's like 6 foot by 8 foot. And I had this grant again to hire models, and I had models coming into my studio on campus, and they were coming in, separately, and they were total strangers. And so, I was really interested in these complexities of relationships, right? I thought that's what I was making work about. And so like this painting was about an unnecessary consolation. And, the main event happens right here, like in the center, and it's organized so everything spirals off of that. And, I wanted this kind of glowy light and to use pattern to kind of compress that space. But I also felt like really disconnected from this painting. And I think some of that was, like I had strangers coming into my space and I didn't know them, and they weren't interacting with each other. So like it was a really kind of contrived painting. And I also felt like I was making someone else's painting a little bit. Like it really didn't connect to me necessarily. And so that was a little bit of a crisis. But then after my first year of grad school, I was able to go back to Italy. And I was really thinking about human relationships and this idea of like intimacy and touch, and, like what it is, like the dynamics and the facets of being, like emotionally connected to another person. And so these visitation paintings really, really, kind of struck me at the time. So Pontormo's Visitation was one. This is actually an Albertinelli painting that lives in the Uffizi. And the visitation, the narrative there, if you don't know it, I think it's the two Marys. They're both pregnant, and it's the moment that they're about to tell each other. And so, I was looking at things like, touch and proximity, but really what was like magical about this painting and about this theme is like how this negative space operates. Right. So like there's this like little sliver of space between their heads that brings them together, but it also contains this secret. And, I thought that was like magical at the time, that like a negative shape could contain like the whole story. That's really what was making the painting and the story itself work. And so I came back and I tried to make those paintings. And I kind of rethought how I was working in the studio. I think I have like a naturally kind of clunky or heavy hand. And it's something that, up to this point, I was working really hard to subvert, like I was trying to control it and to make things right. And, I was working from observation and measuring carefully and that sort of thing. And at this point, like I really just let it go and decided that, like I would try to exploit, like those natural tendencies in my hands. And I also got two friends to come sit for me. So these were classmates of mine. They're still really good friends of mine, and they're good friends with each other. So Jamie and Christine were coming down to my studio at the same time and sitting with each other. And I really wanted the painting to be about this relationship between them. But, again, like I'm pretty much taking from those visitation paintings. And, at the end of grad school, I started making these really large charcoal drawings. And I thought that they would be preparatory work for painting. And that's exactly how I was thinking. Like I could work through ideas, like I could actually like organize the space faster in drawing. And this drawing is probably about 5.5 feet. So the figures are about to scale. And I started using myself. And at first I thought like I was just going to use myself as kind of a stand-in to get things figured out. But then I started thinking about kind of using myself as this kind of like character. So I was, kind of getting like points of reference there, still thinking about like that visitation idea, like the space between the figures, kind of containing the secret, but maybe the nature of that relationship starts to take on a little bit of a different tone. And so I finished graduate school and I found that, when I left graduate school, I didn't have a studio space and I was really poor, and charcoal drawing was a way of working through painting ideas that allowed me to keep going when I had sort of these restrictions on like what was happening logistically in my life. And so I worked through a series of these drawings, kind of jumping off of those visitation paintings. And they really became about, like these sort of intricacies of female relationships and those kinds of complexities. And these are all, again, like large scale. So between 50 inches and probably 75 inches. And then there starts to be maybe like a suggested, like atmosphere or time of day or space in these. And then these span a few years. I think when I was making these drawings, I had, like recently had a kid, and they became more about like internal conflicts, sort of contradictions in myself, or these kinds of internal tensions. And then, kind of rewinding back to that trip in grad school, the other thing that I was looking at, in the between first and second years in grad school was these like monumental sculptures. And I was drawing a lot from these sculptures and making a lot of really bad drawings, actually. But I was really interested in these monumental figures, and specifically like the vulnerability inherent in the exposed monumental figure. And this is one of Michelangelo's slaves that kind of perfectly captures that. And so, again, kind of thinking about this kind of confrontational monumental pose. And when I was making these drawings, I was really thinking about like what it means to inhabit a body, physically. So I wasn't necessarily thinking about making a likeness of myself so much as I was thinking about what it felt like to be in a body, specifically like what it feels like to be like in a female body, right? Like there's a kind of vulnerability that's just inherent in inhabiting a female body. And, like I have a relatively small female body that doesn't necessarily feel that way all the time. And so with that vulnerability, like I was trying to, kind of expose myself literally, like literally show the viewer my belly. And, again, kind of letting these distortions happen. I was thinking a lot about like mannerist painting and the kinds of distortions that happen, in those paintings. These also span a few years, so this is relatively recent. And, with the charcoal drawings, like I'd been working primarily in charcoal, and I think there's a way with charcoal that you can kind of hide behind the medium. Like it will allow for some things or suggest a lot for you. And I don't think that that's the case necessarily with graphite. I think, you're working with a pencil, every mark and every decision is there. And so I wanted to kind of go in the opposite direction and make work where all of the decisions were apparent in the drawing, that there was this kind of history or this like palimpsestic mark, that like the layering of that mark was starting to show the process of the drawing and the passage of time that was taking place over, multiple sittings. And, again, working from myself, mostly from direct observation. And this is graphite and acrylic. And then, I was kind of interested from there in how the graphite, like how that pencil was really slowing me down. And so I took some time and I wanted to make a drawing where I was really holding myself accountable, that, like I was trying to make, this observed drawing, and not just like a technically good drawing, but like, what was it to really like look and record something? And so I made a self-portrait, kind of thinking about this idea that like my body was changing and it's going to continue to change. That, like this is sort of a moment in time and I'm recording my own physicality. But I also really became interested in this kind of like indexical mark making, that, like I was making these really kind of slow, deliberate marks. And so the drawing became sort of this recording of looking. So the mark making is maybe as important or more important than the image itself. And I started asking people that I'm close to sit for me. And, I hadn't done this for like a really long time. And what I found is that like when you're drawing someone, it's totally different than like when you're drawing from a hired model. That, like this is such an extremely vulnerable situation. And I was, like asking people to sit, up to like 20 hours. And so it really was about this kind of space between us that like this person was allowing me to look at them very closely. And we were, doing that for an extreme like length of time. And, I think of the drawing as being a recording of that space and that time and, kind of a mutual vulnerability more so than, like a drawing of, people that I'm close to necessarily. I also drew my son. And I don't necessarily like this drawing technically, but I'm really glad that I made this drawing. I made this drawing sort of with that same idea that I was going to look at him closely. And this is different maybe from the previous drawings because, it's not about this direct engagement between the two of us. There was, like a lot of YouTube involved there. But he did sit for me, which I think was like pretty spectacular for like a 10-year-old to sit for, I think it was like, again, like a 20-hour drawing. And what was important to me in making this drawing was that I was doing this, like I was looking really, really closely at this person that I'm going to lose, that like is going to disappear. And so like, even now, like literally this person doesn't exist. Like he's lost to me. And, like he's still around, but like, I don't have a 10-year-old with like chubby little hands. I have a kid who's like 9 inches taller than I am now. And so, kind of thinking about like drawing as an act of like this point in time and, this sort of like idea of loss that comes with parenting. And I'm going to use that to segue into a body of paintings. These are not necessarily in chronological order. And so I'm going to kind of jump around by bodies of work as they relate maybe to different ideas rather than showing things like sequentially. I was making a body of paintings about sleep because I was interested in this kind of inaccessibility that happens in a state of sleep. So we're inaccessible to each other. We're kind of inaccessible to ourselves to some degree. And Sharon Olds wrote a poem called Sighs and Sheer Will about basically the fact that like as her son was growing, he was becoming, more inaccessible to her, that, it's something that, it's kind of bittersweet that like we want to happen, but it's also like there's this sense of loss there. And so I made this painting in response to that of my son sleeping. And it again has this kind of spiral composition where it moves up the sheets and around. And you kind of like circles through the cat there and comes back around. And then his arm is actually disproportionately long. So there's like literally kind of this suggestion of growth. And it's also, kind of this painting for me personally about, growth and loss. Like he was growing rapidly at that point. And then we had our 19-year-old cat here who like we knew wouldn't be with us much longer and always slept with him. And so I really wanted to get, the cat sort of in that kind of same, circular spiral there. And then also in this painting happened in that body of work really close to the same time. Over spring break, I had been in London and I came back and got to the studio. And when I started this painting, my aunt fell into a coma and she wasn't going to recover from that coma. And it was like a matter of days. And my niece was waiting to be born sort of in that same window of time. And so it really was, this kind of like strange and devastating period where I didn't know what to do. And so I would go from like the hospital to the studio and this painting just sort of came out of me. I have an Annie Dillard quote in my studio where she kind of paraphrases Buckminster Fuller that like we create in order to kind of balance the entropy of the world. And so I think that kind of captured what was happening literally, but also like that response that like I needed to make a painting to make sense of that. And, I wasn't totally aware of it, but, I had just also seen this painting, which is the baptism of Christ. And it seems like really fitting that, this painting is about, a kind of rebirth, but also like this pose here, like this is just such a gorgeous, gorgeous pose. And so these are some details. And this painting, it's 2 panels, 4 foot by 6 foot. So together it's an 8-foot painting, 8 foot by 6 foot. So, the figures are again, like about twice life size. They're really fairly monumental. Detail at the top and at the bottom. And at the same time that I was making those paintings, I was thinking about, drawing. And again, like the drawing kind of being a little bit ahead of the painting, that I could kind of work through ideas in drawing. And also, I was kind of interested in the drawing being its own thing, and telling a story in this kind of straightforward sense that, like, what if I actually just kind of embraced this narrative and tried to make a drawing about like an actual event, rather than, being like a little bit indirect. And so when my son was 6, he was convinced that he could catch a wild rabbit. And we would walk to school and he would talk to me about how he was going to feed the rabbits and make friends with them. And then they could like come inside, and I would tell him that, you probably can't catch a wild rabbit. And, like that's probably not going to work out. And there was one night where I had fallen asleep and he woke up and went outside and picked up a wild rabbit and brought it inside and woke me up and was, standing there with the rabbit. And it really became part of like our family lore. Like this was a story that he wanted to tell everyone, and he wanted to like recount it, like relive it every day at breakfast, like remember it then. And so I wanted to make this drawing about, like his experience from his point of view, like this really kind of like magical event that he was so certain was going to happen. And so this is Tillman and his rabbit. Lots of detail there. And this drawing, it's about 8 foot by 8 foot, so 2 panels together. And I was thinking a lot about that scale, starting to operate like a stage. So there's like this kind of theatrical aspect to it, that it's a space that we're removed from, that it's, very much an artificial situation, but, it's engaging with our space, almost like we would watch a play. And then I started thinking a lot about like how paintings tell stories. And there was a show of pre-Raphaelite paintings at the Hirshhorn a few years ago. And I really don't respond to these paintings. Like I think they're really hard to look at. But I was really intrigued by the essay, because the essay was kind of talking about, how like that hyper realism is actually kind of surreal because we don't edit that way. But also like thinking about these narratives, like these kind of Arthurian legends, like they're really bizarre. And the way that they're presented, I also find really bizarre. So like people can be sitting around the table, like having dinner or having an argument, and somebody's head is buried in a pot of basil. And this is the Waterhouse painting about the Lady of Shalott. And so the legend there, or the story, is that she's trapped in a tower and she's forced to weave these tapestries of the world that she can only view out her window. And if she leaves the tower to join the world, then she'll die, which is eventually, what happens in the narrative. And there are, some pre-Raphaelite paintings about that too. And so I was kind of thinking about like, could I hang a drawing on that? And I was making this allusion to the Lady of Shalott by thinking about like, I was in the studio trying to make a drawing about like domestic spaces, about my life outside of the studio. But, paradoxically, I was trapped in the studio in order to make the drawing. Like I couldn't leave the studio. And so it becomes also about this kind of like detritus and domestic clutter. And these are some details. And at this point, these are 3 panels. So it's 8 feet by 12 feet. Like they kind of keep growing. And that central figure, and then details of the side. See the dog Levi. There's actually like a little chipmunk hidden down here. So the dog being tortured by a chipmunk, the cat catching a mouse, and then, just sort of this accumulation of stuff, kids' drawings. And then this is actually a little postcard of this painting. And here I'm going to kind of jump back and forth in time. I wanted to talk about this painting and the subsequent drawing, just because I think it is like a really good segue, a really good connection to what I've been thinking about more recently. But the drawing itself happened, several years ago. This painting is Bellini's St. Francis receiving the Stigmata, and it lives in the Frick, and it's a really weird painting. Like, it's a really strange and beautiful and very blue painting. James Elkins, the art historian, wrote an essay about this painting that I really loved. And he was talking about, just sort of the narrative, like St. Francis receiving the Stigmata. When you look at this theme in art history, like a lot of times, like the event, like receiving the Stigmata is like, like a laser show. Like it is really, kind of dramatic. But in this rendition, like it's really, really quiet, right? So, and then St. Francis is the patron saint of animals. And so when you look at this painting, you can start to find, like here's a rabbit and a bird and a donkey, and there are goats back here. But also, just these little kind of quiet moments where the animals actually come out to bear witness, right? So they're bearing witness to this event, that there's just this like slight movement where the donkey turns his ear, sort of in recognition, and the bunny pops his head out. And here's this really kind of quiet, like there's just a dot, like that's it, right? And I became really interested in the idea of animals and nature bearing witness, and nature as maybe like a stabilizer. And when I was making this drawing, I was going through a separation and then a divorce. And I was thinking about, like vulnerability and stepping into the unknown. So there's this tension between the two figures. And then at the same time, kind of putting myself in this uncertain environment, like out in nature, but then using nature as that stabilizing force where, life is going to go on after this, like nature is going to be there. And, the animals are there to kind of bear witness. And so there are these little hidden moments where there's a turtle that comes out, and the finch. And this is Gunther much, much later. So just to kind of switch gears a little bit, but I think, again, like this is really related. I grew up around horses. I grew up riding horses. I still ride horses. And, when I was a kid, like I would draw horses in notebooks. And it was something that like I just never thought about as a subject. And I was having a conversation with a friend about like what you need to give yourself permission to do, like what subject would you need to give yourself permission to make work about. And, for me, it's like, could I make a drawing about a horse? And, when I started to think about like the possibilities of that, it really became about like, what do I know, right? Like, what do I know by touch? What do I know the physicality of? And so I started to kind of think like, in order to pull this off, like I really wanted to make a drawing about what a horse feels like. And so instead of, something that feels sentimental, I wanted to think about, like the physical presence of a horse. And, like when I think of a horse, like horses are big and kind of dangerous because they think they're going to die all the time. Like they think something's after them. So, it's not something that I feel like really sweetly about, but it's something that I feel like I know really well. And so I was also thinking about like when I was making this drawing about the internal life of an animal. So like what happens if I'm removed from that equation, and kind of thinking about something outside of myself. And horses are herd animals. And so they form like really close bonds with each other. And when I was looking at this horse, like going out and studying this horse, like he had just lost his friend. And, I think there is like this kind of like sense of like mourning there that, like there's a psychology to the horse. I was also starting to go back to, like that place, that very first black and white image. I was going out to that space again, maybe for the first time in like 30 years. And I started thinking about, how that space has been there the whole time, right? Like the space never really changed. And my life kind of went around And I was circling back to this space in a way that made it both really strange to me and also really familiar, that like I knew the vegetation and I knew the space, like really by heart, the way that you know a place as a kid. But it was also, a place that I was approaching as an adult. And so I continued to make work there. And I was trying to think about how the horse like owns this space more than I do now. And so the horse kind of fits into that space and I'm outside of it. This is about 8 feet by 4.5 feet. This is my like contour monade there. And I was reading this kind of Nicole Krauss book that it's called Forest Dark, and it's this metaphysical kind of midlife crisis where she talks about returning to a childhood place as a way of rewriting your own history or as a kind of new start. And so I really kind of thought about like going back to this place where I had grown up as a way of rethinking my life as an adult and maybe kind of rewriting my own narrative and giving myself like this kind of new beginning. And when I'm making these drawings, like they're composites. So I'm working from sketches and photos, and I'm working in the studio. And so there's, kind of a mishmash of, where I'm getting information from. And, like a lot of it is like imagined, but I am, kind of setting up direct light sources and kind of thinking about how that light works. And so here, like this is waxing gibbous. We've got Iris, the dog here, kind of holding that space. And I started thinking about that idea of, like the animals maybe being more comfortable in that space and this human presence as being, maybe something that is a little bit more uncertain, that we're not nearly as comfortable in this space as the animals. And so I was playing with that idea with this drawing here. And again, thinking about, like the drawing almost as like a stage set, this kind of theatrical quality that's happening. And I was really, also trying to slow the viewer down with the amount of information. So it becomes a longer read. And then, I wanted to subvert the figure almost entirely. And I started thinking about using the animals as kind of a proxy where, we're kind of relating to the narrative through the animals rather than through the figures. And, I didn't have a direct narrative here, but I was still thinking about this idea of like uncertainty and, the kind of new beginnings and going off into this unknown territory or unknown environment. And I started with this dog, Sunny the dog. This is not my dog. And this is probably like the most neurotic dog I know, but he's also super sweet. And he was living with me at the time and just like life was a struggle for this dog. And so I wanted to like kind of make him the center point of the drawing and build on it from there, kind of thinking about using him as a character more or less. And then again, there are these hidden moments in the drawings. We've got the crows in the trees to kind of bear witness to what's unfolding. Another detail. And then a couple of years ago, I was really fortunate to do a residency at the Tallgrass National Preserve, which is in the Flint Hills in Kansas. And it's a really special landscape because it's the last kind of swath of the tallgrass prairie, which basically ran down the central or the center of North America. And I spent 2 weeks on this 10,000 acre property with the dog by myself. And it was fabulous. I didn't make drawings. I would go out and I would hike every single day, like miles and miles and miles. And I spent a lot of time looking down. So you can see like this landscape is not where we're at here. Like this is big and wide and open, much different from what you all are trying to paint. But when I was hiking, I was spending a lot of time looking down and, going in through creek beds and collecting things. And then I was also thinking about, like deep time. So, like the fact that like this is the last swath of tall grass prairie, really kind of meant something to me. And there was a kind of imagination, sort of embedded in the place that if you kind of think about like, this is what, the whole, sort of like middle of North America used to look like. And, this kind of like, what is the history beyond human history and what are native species? And so I was thinking a lot about that when I started making these drawings. And there's an Italian literary phrase. It's Sicilian, and it translates roughly to time takes no time in a story. And it's something that I think about in all of the work, but I think especially in this body of work, it was something that kept coming up. And, what that means is that like a writer has the ability to expand and collapse time at will, that like really any storyteller does. And so, like 30 years can happen in a paragraph. And I thought about that, like, could I really like expand and collapse time on the page? Like, could I think about these layers of time and species and also these really kind of small anecdotal events happening? So, there's a way that this situation is highly artificial and is also, like observed. And so these are details here. I was thinking about, things that I had actually seen and species that I had learned and research that I was doing and trying to get all of this to kind of happen almost in like a diorama. And so the drawing itself is about 15 feet, but then, I'm embedding these really kind of small moments down to the mouse here and the snake. And then there's like a little snail and a spider. And so all of these things are coexisting in the same space. I'm also thinking about like the artifice of the drawing itself. And so this is a really large drawing, but I have literally touched like every square inch of the surface. So you can see I have this like really narrow retractable eraser, which is kind of like I couldn't live without, but it actually allows me to touch every square inch of the surface. And so I want my hand to be present there. So, both as a reminder that this is an artificial situation, but also, kind of establishing me as the narrator, that like we're kind of buying into this suspension of disbelief in order to make sense of this much time in a story. I'm going to go through a few images, just like the process of the work. I think a lot of times it's kind of curious to see how, or interesting to see how work is made. And so most of the time I don't really start with a plan. Like I start with paper in the studio. And my sketches are really fast. Like I usually draw in pen on Mylar or notebook paper, and they take, about 5 minutes. I have like weird notes to myself that I may or may not make sense of. For this drawing, I had watercolor studies. I'd taken a couple images. And then you can kind of see how those come up. And then as the drawings get bigger, I think the drawings or the sketches get like a little crazier. So you can see like I have a light source, and then like there's a skull and some figures, and the idea of the deer stuck and this dog happened in the middle. And then, I'm starting with, again, like this kind of event here, and then working off of that. And with this drawing especially, I think you can kind of see the changes that this dog starts, the deer comes in, and then that dog goes away and is replaced by this dog. This figure's here, goes away. This figure kind of pops in. So there's, kind of a malleability that happens in the process, like really kind of responding to what the drawing needs. And yeah, this one I think was ghost and raccoon and coyote and like this kind of mint skeleton somehow. And the drawing changes pretty significantly. And I think I'm just going to show a couple images of more recent work. So during the pandemic, I left my studio, and I was really interested in this like kind of stillness that happened. And so I started making drawings about like looking down and isolating just this, like really kind of small area and trying to hide things in those images. So there's like the little woodcock hidden down here. Some birds back here, whale birds. And then that Luna moth pops up again. And so, I was trying to, again, like make drawings that reflected a way that I was looking at the space and kind of slowing things down. I think that's it.
You spoke about the people thinking.
I keep a sketchbook that really isn't a sketchbook. It's just sort of this pile of information. And sometimes I'm taking notes about my work, and sometimes I'm taking notes about what I'm looking at or trying to process, what I've seen or what I've read. Sometimes I'm writing down recipes or directions, or, and so it's random, like I don't edit. And I try to keep the same book for a long period of time. And what I found is that like if I go in reverse and look over a period of a few years, I can start to find these through lines where like, oh, this is how everything connects, or this is how this idea relates to this idea. But I think, just kind of that habit of trying to put everything in the same place is actually really meaningful to me, because I think my work does kind of break the boundaries between real life and the studio life. Like I have to kind of bring my life into the studio and vice versa in order to make things work.
Ever illustrated her books, or would you consider illustration for fiction?
I haven't. And I think in some ways the way that I work isn't very practical, and sort of like intentionally that I know, like I think about this occasionally and chastise myself for not making, paintings that like I can contain. I have these like big drawings and they have a lifespan and they disintegrate essentially. Like they, I can show them a few times and then they go away. And so I think I've been more interested in that than necessarily making an image that has a function or that can be preserved, if that makes any sense.
Right. So you mentioned earlier on how we want to actually heavier hands and a lot of your work, but more recent drawings feel very delicate and soft. But that might just be the finished product. How do those two things relate?
For me, I think I can negotiate that through scale. And so like, I really struggle to make small work. Like that, it's something that feels really forced to me. And, like a lot of times I have a much harder time working this scale than I do like this scale. And so I think there's kind of a balance that happens if I can make like a big mark or a big movement of value that allows me to like counterbalance with these details. But if I have to get something to be based off of like a really small surface area, then I have a much harder time. So
I want to know about the the use or the not use of color in your narrative in your art. So I was wondering, is it more about the medium in which you're working, or do you find that you prefer to have a narrative there without the color?
I think there are two parts to that, and there's a lot of work that I'm not showing, and part of me really wants these to be paintings. I think in painting. You know, I think a lot of these are painting ideas that I'm translating through drawing. The other part of me really thinks about the drawing as an artifact. And there is this kind of like hierarchy, you know, of like drawing and painting, where like drawing is not as consequential as painting. And I think it is also, you know, one of those things where it's like slightly ephemeral, like the paper disintegrates. And I like that quality to the drawings. Like I actually like the fact that like they're temporary. And, you know, I think that kind of relates to the subject matter that I'm working with. And so I'm torn. I really want to make paintings, you know, about these drawings, but I also like am having a hard time giving the drawings up. With color, you know, like I love color and I'm not a good colorist. And so that's, you know, like also a struggle too. Like I don't know how to get that same atmosphere, that same air in color. And so like I kind of question, you know, like what I'm trying to do. But so I think there's some logistical limitations.
What paint do you use? Sometimes it looks like a watercolor.
When I paint, I paint in oil. I tend to like Williamsburg. Like I like that dense waxiness. The drawings, aside from that body of graphite drawings, the drawings are all in charcoal, and I work on arches and Stonehenge. And so there's large drawings that are arches watercolor, so it has a little bit more of a tooth, but they're achromatic entirely.
Can you talk a little bit about when and how you come up with this?
I think that's evolved over the years. Like now, I think when I'm making preparatory work, it starts as like a big movement, right? Like I just have this idea of like moving from one side to the other. But I think about, you know, this kind of hierarchy of, you know, like big moves versus small moves. And it's something that like I need to respond to in the drawing. I think going back to the earlier work, the painting that you were talking about with the yellow table, you know, that was something that I really kind of plotted out. And I was, you know, thinking about the architecture of the space and using the geometry of the space as a means of dividing, you know, inside and outside, and, you know, making the figures exist in separate worlds. And so, you know, that was something where I was really conscious of, you know, like the placement of things. But I think in all of my work, I have been open to moving things around. And I think it's, you know, for me, it's really important to be able to respond to the work in process, like where it starts to talk back to me in order to, you know, kind of keep it alive, and also to kind of, you know, figure out, like a lot of times, like some of these ideas maybe crystallize like as I'm working on them. Like I don't know, like especially with these big drawings, like I can start with a couple ideas, but I really don't know what it is. I don't know what's going to happen. And so like I need to be able to kind of work fluidly that way.
We have a few Zoom questions.
Okay.
That are nice and straightforward. So, what artists are you influenced by? And two, what kind of charcoal are you using?
Oh, I'll go the other way around. Charcoal, like I go back and forth with. Usually, I get like the Utrecht big fat sticks, and it's just like the Utrecht brand, but they're like the inch in diameter sticks, and I go through it really quickly. I think I've inhaled a lot of charcoal. And artists that I'm influenced by, that's like a really long list. And, you know, I was thinking about this, like the influences that I showed are all art historical influences and mostly Italian influences, because I really wanted to make that connection between how I'm telling a story and looking, you know, specifically at Italian painting. But I really look widely, and I think a lot about contemporary painting. You know, I think like Kyle Staver is someone that I think about in terms of like being able to tell a story, and Anne Harris, you know, that kind of like psychological quality that you know, really kind of gets you in the gut. But yeah, like I can't limit it there, and it's a really long list.
So
I think that was something that I was really conscious of with there's the double portraits and the self-portraits, those self-portraits especially. And I was thinking a lot about like Mannerist painting and the kind of like these really kind of delicate hand gestures. And, like when I'm looking at painting, it's something that, it's kind of funny. Like if you look at like a Bellini or if you look at like a Mannerist painting, it's like you almost want to like make that gesture, right? Like can a hand do that? And there's a kind of delicacy there that like I kind of associate with a vulnerability, right? That like when we gesture with the hands, or, like this kind of movement against like a heavy volume or a mass is this, kind of juxtaposition that in my head, I think speaks to the kind of vulnerability that I was trying to present in the figures.
You used the phrase deep time, and I was wondering if you could expand on that and what these are.
So when I was thinking about, like deep time being on the prairie, it in my mind, it kind of means like pre-human time or sort of like occupation of that space. And like the space like existing outside of a human presence, that, just like that span of time is almost difficult to like wrap your head around because we're thinking so much about like what's right in front of us. And I think when you're in an expansive space like that really has been untouched for, like thousands of years, like you start to realize, just sort of like how big time is. I think from like an ecological perspective in that space, I think there's a lot about like native species, both plant and animal species that we don't see anymore, right? That, like what's native to that place. And so like when you imagine that, like you have to imagine a whole different situation. Like you have to imagine that space being occupied by, like different inhabitants. And I loved that. I mean, I loved it. And I was also sort of like heartbroken by it, but at the same time. And so, like, that's what I wanted to kind of make work about. Like, could I, sort of like think about that much time by creating this like really kind of closed, diorama kind of space.
Thank you.